Hi there. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're sitting around a campfire 30,000 years ago. The flames are crackling, shadows are dancing on cave walls, and suddenly you hear something moving in the darkness beyond your circle of light. Your heart starts pounding. Every instinct in your body is screaming that something dangerous might be out there. But here's the fascinating part. Instead of just running away or grabbing a weapon, your ancestor did something remarkable. They started to imagine what that something might be. They began to wonder if it had intentions, if it was watching them, if it could be reasoned with or appeased. That moment of imagination, that leap from pure survival instinct to abstract thinking, was one of the most significant developments in human history. It was the beginning of our species' relationship with the invisible, the unknown, and ultimately, with gods. The question of why humans invented gods isn't just an academic curiosity. It's the story of how we became who we are today. Every culture that has ever existed, from the most isolated tribes to the most sophisticated civilizations, has developed some form of spiritual belief system. This isn't a coincidence. There's something fundamental about the human brain, something wired into our very nature, that compels us to seek explanations for the unexplainable and to find meaning in the chaos of existence. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. The invention of gods wasn't just about fear or ignorance, though those played important roles. It was about our species developing the most powerful tool we've ever created. More powerful than fire, more revolutionary than agriculture, more transformative than any technology we've ever built. That tool was belief itself. The capacity to believe in something beyond immediate sensory experience became the foundation for everything that makes us distinctly human. Our ability to cooperate in massive groups, to build civilizations, to create art and literature and philosophy, all of it stems from this fundamental capacity to believe. First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me in religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like just another story about primitive people making up fairy tales because they didn't understand lightning or earthquakes. But the reality is far more complex and, frankly, more interesting. The development of religious thinking represents one of the most sophisticated evolutionary adaptations our species ever achieved. It required advanced cognitive abilities that took millions of years to develop. Our ancestors had to evolve the capacity for abstract thought, symbolic communication, and something called theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other beings have thoughts, feelings, and intentions different from your own. Consider what had to happen in the human brain for religious thinking to emerge. First, our ancestors needed to develop what scientists call hyperactive agency detection. This is basically the tendency to assume that events in the environment are caused by some kind of intentional agent, even when there's no evidence for it. If you heard rustling in the bushes, it was better to assume it was a predator and be wrong than to assume it was just wind and end up as someone's dinner. Those who survived were the ones who erred on the side of caution, who saw potential agents everywhere. But agency detection alone wasn't enough. Our ancestors also had to develop the ability to apply human-like characteristics to non-human things. They started attributing emotions, intentions, and personalities to natural phenomena. The storm wasn't just wind and rain. It was an angry spirit. The volcano wasn't just geological activity. It was a powerful being expressing its displeasure. This tendency to humanize the world around us became so deeply ingrained that we still do it today without thinking about it. We talk about our cars being temperamental. We say the weather is angry. We describe the stock market as having moods. The third crucial development was what researchers call promiscuous teleology. This is the tendency to assume that everything exists for a purpose, that everything was designed with intention. Children naturally think this way. They'll tell you that rocks exist to make the ground hard, or that clouds exist to give us rain. Adults learn to suppress this kind of thinking in some contexts, but it never completely goes away. This teleological thinking created fertile ground for the idea that the entire universe was designed and created by some kind of intelligent agent. These three cognitive developments, hyperactive agency detection, theory of mind, and promiscuous teleology, created the perfect storm for religious thinking. But there was one more ingredient that made the invention of gods almost inevitable: death. The moment our ancestors became self-aware enough to understand that they would die, they faced a psychological crisis that no other species has ever had to confront. They could see their future non-existence, and it terrified them. This terror of death, what psychologists call mortality salience, became one of the most powerful driving forces in human psychology. Every culture that has ever existed has developed elaborate beliefs about what happens after death. Some promise eternal paradise, others describe cycles of rebirth, still others envision a shadowy underworld. But virtually all of them offer some form of continuation beyond physical death. This isn't a coincidence. The promise of immortality, whether literal or symbolic, addresses one of our deepest psychological needs. But let's dig deeper into the timeline of how this actually unfolded. The earliest evidence of what we might call religious behavior comes from archaeological sites that are almost impossibly ancient. In the Czech Republic, archaeologists have discovered what they believe to be the burial of a Paleolithic shaman, a woman who lived approximately 30,000 years ago. Her burial was unlike any other from that period. She was surrounded by unusual objects, positioned in a specific way, and clearly treated with a level of reverence that suggests her community saw her as a spiritual intermediary. This discovery is remarkable for several reasons. First, it shows that complex spiritual beliefs were already well developed 30,000 years ago. Second, it suggests that the earliest religious practitioners might have been women, challenging our assumptions about prehistoric gender roles. Most importantly, it demonstrates that even our Paleolithic ancestors felt the need to create formal roles for people who could communicate with the spiritual realm. The religious system that this ancient shaman likely practiced was probably animistic. Animism is considered the earliest form of religious belief, and it's based on the idea that everything in the natural world has a spirit or soul. Rocks, trees, rivers, animals, weather patterns, all of them were seen as possessing consciousness and agency. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was a sophisticated way of understanding the world that emphasized relationship and reciprocity, rather than domination and control. For hundreds of thousands of years, our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived within animistic frameworks. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature. They saw themselves as part of an interconnected web of spiritual relationships. When they needed to hunt an animal, they would ask permission from its spirit. When they gathered plants, they would offer thanks and take only what they needed. This created sustainable relationships with the environment that allowed human communities to thrive for millennia without depleting their resources. The development from animism to more complex religious systems happened gradually, but one of the most significant turning points came with the agricultural revolution approximately 10,000 years ago. When humans began domesticating plants and animals, their relationship with the natural world fundamentally changed. They could no longer maintain the same reciprocal spiritual relationship with wheat that they owned and harvested, or with sheep that they controlled and slaughtered. This created a religious crisis that required new solutions. If you own a sheep, you can't pray to the sheep for healthy lambs, because the sheep is now your property and theoretically under your control. You don't pray to something less powerful than you are. Humans needed to find new spiritual authorities, beings powerful enough to control the forces they couldn't. This need gave birth to the gods as we typically think of them today. The transition from animism to polytheism represented humanity's attempt to maintain spiritual control over natural forces they couldn't physically dominate, while acknowledging their new position of relative power over domesticated species. Instead of a world filled with spiritual equals, humans began to conceive of a spiritual hierarchy with themselves in the middle, above the natural world they increasingly controlled, but below the gods who controlled what they could not. This shift had profound psychological and social implications. For the first time in human history, people began to see themselves as separate from and superior to the natural world. This change in perspective would eventually make possible everything from large-scale agriculture to industrial civilization, but it also created new anxieties and spiritual needs that required increasingly sophisticated religious systems to address. As human societies grew larger and more complex, their gods evolved as well. Small tribal deities gave way to regional gods and eventually to universal deities that could unite vast populations under common belief systems. This wasn't just about spiritual needs. It was about practical social requirements. Large-scale cooperation between strangers requires shared beliefs and values, and religion provided the most effective way to create that shared framework. The story of how humans invented gods is really the story of how we invented ourselves. Every major development in human civilization, from the first cave paintings to the latest scientific discoveries, has been shaped by our unique capacity for belief. We are the species that can imagine what isn't there, believe in what can't be seen, and organize our entire lives around ideas that exist only in our minds. This capacity has made us the most successful species on the planet, but it has also created challenges and contradictions that we're still trying to understand. The invention of gods wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process that continues today. Every generation reinterprets and reshapes their spiritual beliefs to address the specific challenges and opportunities of their time. Understanding this process isn't just about understanding our past. It's about understanding who we are and where we might be headed as a species. A species. The relationship between fear and religious innovation becomes even more fascinating when we examine specific historical moments where human societies faced existential crises. During periods of plague, famine, or natural disaster, religious systems didn't just provide comfort. They evolved rapidly to address new realities. The Black Death in medieval Europe, for example, didn't just kill a third of the population. It fundamentally transformed Christian theology. Suddenly, existing explanations for suffering seemed inadequate, and new religious movements emerged that emphasized personal mystical experience and direct communication with the divine. This pattern of crisis-driving religious innovation reveals something crucial about how gods are invented and reinvented. They are not static concepts handed down unchanged from ancient times. They are dynamic responses to human needs that shift and evolve as those needs change. The gods of hunter-gatherers were very different from the gods of agricultural societies, which were different again from the gods of urban civilizations, and so on through history. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The invention of gods created a feedback loop that began to shape human evolution itself. Once our ancestors started believing in supernatural agents who could reward or punish behavior, those beliefs began to influence which individuals survived and reproduced. People who could effectively navigate social hierarchies based on religious beliefs, who could inspire others through spiritual leadership, or who could use religious frameworks to build cooperative alliances gained significant advantages. This created what scientists call gene-culture coevolution. Our cultural innovations, including religious beliefs, began to influence our biological evolution. Some researchers have even proposed that certain genetic variations might predispose individuals to religious thinking. While this remains controversial, what's clear is that humans who lived in societies with strong religious institutions had different survival pressures than those who didn't. The development of written language marked another crucial turning point in the evolution of religious thinking. For the first time, spiritual beliefs could be recorded, standardized, and transmitted across generations without change. This created the possibility for more complex theological systems, and also for religious authority to become institutionalized in ways that were previously impossible. Written religious texts didn't just preserve beliefs, they transformed them. When spiritual teachings were passed down orally, they naturally evolved and adapted to new circumstances with each telling. But once they were written down, they gained a kind of permanence that made them seem more authoritative and unchangeable. This shift had enormous implications for how religious power was distributed in society. The invention of writing also made possible the development of religious laws and moral codes that could be applied consistently across large populations. The Code of Hammurabi, the Torah, the teachings of Confucius, all of these represented attempts to create universal standards of behavior based on divine authority. This was revolutionary because it meant that strangers from different tribes or regions could share common moral frameworks, making large-scale cooperation possible in ways that had never existed before. But perhaps the most significant development in the evolution of religious thinking was the emergence of monotheism. The idea that there might be only one God, responsible for everything in the universe, represented a radical departure from earlier polytheistic systems. This wasn't just a matter of reducing the number of deities. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of how the universe works. Monotheism offered several advantages over earlier religious systems. It provided a unified explanation for all natural phenomena. It created clearer moral frameworks by eliminating conflicts between different gods' demands. And it offered the possibility of universal religious communities that could transcend tribal and ethnic boundaries. But it also created new problems and contradictions that theologians are still trying to resolve today. The question of evil provides a perfect example. In a polytheistic system, bad things happen because different gods have conflicting interests or because malevolent deities cause harm. But if there's only one God who is both all-powerful and perfectly good, how do you explain suffering and injustice? This problem, known as theodicy, has generated thousands of years of theological debate and has driven many of the most sophisticated developments in religious philosophy. The psychological appeal of monotheism runs much deeper than its logical advantages. It satisfies something fundamental about how human minds work. We have a natural tendency to look for single, simple explanations for complex phenomena. We want to believe that there's someone in charge, that there's a plan, that everything happens for a reason. Monotheism provides the ultimate expression of this psychological need. But the development of monotheistic religions also reveals something else about the invention of gods. They tend to reflect the social and political structures of the societies that create them. Ancient polytheistic systems, with their complex pantheons of specialized deities, mirrored the tribal and city-state organizations of early civilizations. Monotheistic religions, with their emphasis on universal law and central authority, emerged alongside the development of large empires that needed unified ideological systems to hold diverse populations together. This pattern continues today. Modern religious movements often incorporate elements that reflect contemporary concerns and values. Environmental theology emphasizes stewardship of nature. Liberation theology focuses on social justice and economic equality. Prosperity theology promises material success through faith. Each of these represents an attempt to make ancient religious frameworks relevant to modern circumstances. The invention of gods also created entirely new categories of human experience and social roles. Before religious thinking emerged, there were no priests, no prophets, no religious rituals or sacred spaces. The development of spiritual beliefs brought into existence whole new realms of human activity and meaning-making that had never existed before. Religious roles became some of the most powerful positions in human societies. Shamans, priests, and other spiritual specialists gained authority not just over ritual practices, but over moral guidance, healing, education, and often political decision-making. This concentration of power in religious institutions would shape the development of human civilization for thousands of years and continues to influence societies around the world today. The creation of sacred spaces represents another unique human innovation that emerged from religious thinking. Temples, churches, mosques, and other religious buildings aren't just functional structures. They're attempts to create physical manifestations of spiritual beliefs. These spaces serve as focal points for community identity, places where the invisible realm of the gods can be made tangible through architecture, art, and ritual. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest monumental architecture built by humans was religious in nature. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which dates back nearly 12,000 years, show that our ancestors were willing to invest enormous amounts of time and energy in creating sacred spaces long before they developed agriculture or permanent settlements. This suggests that religious needs were among the most powerful motivating forces in early human societies. The development of religious art and symbolism created entirely new forms of human expression. Cave paintings, religious sculptures, sacred music, and ritual dance all emerged as ways to represent and communicate spiritual beliefs. These artistic traditions didn't just reflect religious ideas, they helped shape and transmit them. The power of religious imagery to evoke emotional responses and create shared experiences became one of the most effective tools for building and maintaining religious communities. But perhaps the most profound impact of inventing gods was how it changed human relationships with uncertainty and the unknown. Before religious frameworks emerged, our ancestors faced an utterly unpredictable world with no overarching narrative to make sense of their experiences. Random events were just random. Suffering had no meaning. Death was simply the end. Religious thinking transformed this chaotic universe into one with purpose, meaning, and hope. Even when bad things happened, they could be understood as part of a larger plan, as tests of faith, as punishments for wrongdoing, or as stepping stones to better outcomes in an afterlife. This transformation didn't eliminate uncertainty, but it made uncertainty bearable by embedding it within frameworks of meaning. The psychological comfort provided by religious beliefs can't be overstated. Knowing that someone is watching over you, that your actions matter in a cosmic sense, that death isn't the end. These beliefs can provide enormous emotional resilience in the face of life's inevitable hardships. This psychological benefit helps explain why religious beliefs have persisted and thrived even in societies with advanced scientific understanding of natural phenomena. The transformation of uncertainty into meaning through religious belief created what might be the most powerful psychological tool our species has ever developed. But this tool came with unintended consequences that continue to shape human behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. When our ancestors learned to see divine purpose in random events, they also learned to suppress doubt, to accept explanations that couldn't be tested, and to organize their entire worldview around unprovable assumptions. This shift fundamentally altered how humans process information and make decisions. Instead of simply reacting to immediate circumstances, people began filtering their experiences through complex belief systems that promised to explain everything. A drought wasn't just lack of rain, it was divine displeasure. A successful harvest wasn't just good weather and soil, it was reward for proper worship. This interpretive framework gave people a sense of control over uncontrollable forces, but it also created new forms of anxiety and obligation. The social implications of this transformation were equally profound. Once communities shared beliefs about invisible agents who could reward or punish behavior, those beliefs became incredibly powerful tools for social control. Religious leaders could influence people's actions by claiming to know what the gods wanted. Rules and customs could be enforced not just through human authority, but through fear of supernatural consequences. This development marked the beginning of what we might call moral outsourcing. Instead of individuals and communities having to work out ethical frameworks through trial and error, they could simply follow divine commands as interpreted by religious authorities. This system had obvious advantages for maintaining social order, especially in large groups where personal relationships couldn't regulate everyone's behavior. But it also meant that moral reasoning became separated from direct experience and empirical observation. The establishment of religious hierarchies created entirely new forms of social stratification. Priests, shamans, and other spiritual specialists gained power not through physical strength or practical skills, but through their claimed ability to communicate with the divine realm. This represented a revolutionary change in how human societies organized themselves. For the first time, knowledge and interpretation became more valuable than material resources or physical capabilities. These religious hierarchies also created new forms of inequality that persist to this day. Those who controlled access to the divine could accumulate wealth and influence without producing anything tangible. They could demand tribute, labor, and obedience in exchange for spiritual services that couldn't be measured or verified. This system enabled the concentration of resources in ways that had never been possible in earlier, more egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. The development of religious institutions also fundamentally changed how knowledge was created and transmitted. Instead of information flowing freely through communities based on practical experience, it became filtered through religious authorities who determined what could be questioned and what must be accepted on faith. This created powerful mechanisms for preserving cultural traditions, but it also established barriers to innovation and critical thinking that would persist for thousands of years. Religious thinking also transformed human relationships with the natural world in ways that continue to influence our behavior today. The shift from animistic beliefs, where humans saw themselves as part of nature, to hierarchical systems where humans occupied a special position between the material and divine realms, fundamentally altered how our species related to the environment. This change made possible the large-scale manipulation of natural systems that enabled agriculture and civilization, but it also severed the psychological connections that had previously motivated sustainable relationships with the natural world. The invention of afterlife beliefs represents perhaps the most audacious example of human imagination overcoming biological reality. The idea that consciousness could somehow survive the death of the brain required a level of abstract thinking that was unprecedented in the natural world. But once this concept emerged, it became one of the most influential ideas in human history, shaping everything from individual behavior to social institutions to artistic expression. Afterlife beliefs didn't just comfort people facing their own mortality. They created entirely new frameworks for understanding the purpose and meaning of life itself. If existence continued after death, then current experiences could be seen as preparation for what came next. This perspective enabled people to endure tremendous hardships and make enormous sacrifices in pursuit of future rewards that could never be verified in advance. The development of concepts like heaven, hell, reincarnation, and spiritual judgment created powerful motivational systems that could influence behavior across entire lifetimes. People would spend decades following complex rules and rituals based on promises of post-mortem consequences that no one could prove or disprove. This represents an extraordinary example of how abstract ideas can override immediate biological drives and practical considerations. Religious festivals and rituals became some of the most sophisticated forms of social coordination ever developed by human societies. These events brought together large numbers of people in synchronized activities that reinforced shared beliefs and group identity. The psychological impact of participating in collective rituals, especially those involving music, dance, and altered states of consciousness, created powerful emotional experiences that bonded participants together in ways that transcended individual differences. These communal religious experiences also served important practical functions. They provided opportunities for information exchange, mate selection, trade negotiations, and conflict resolution. Religious gatherings became focal points for community life that integrated spiritual, social, and economic activities in ways that strengthened group cohesion and mutual support networks. The role of altered states of consciousness in religious development deserves special attention because it reveals something crucial about the relationship between brain chemistry and spiritual experience. Throughout history, religious practitioners have used various techniques to induce non-ordinary states of consciousness, including fasting, meditation, rhythmic movement, sensory deprivation, and the consumption of psychoactive substances. These altered states often produce experiences that feel profoundly meaningful and seem to provide direct contact with spiritual realms. The consistency of certain features across different cultures and time periods suggests that these experiences reflect fundamental aspects of how human brains process information under altered conditions. This neurological basis for religious experience helps explain why spiritual beliefs feel so compelling and authentic to those who hold them. The development of religious music and chanting represents another fascinating example of how spiritual practices tap into deep-seated neurological responses. Rhythmic sounds and repetitive vocalizations can induce trance-like states that facilitate feelings of unity, transcendence, and connection with the divine. These practices don't just accompany religious beliefs. They help create the psychological conditions that make those beliefs feel real and meaningful. Religious architecture evolved to enhance these psychological effects through the manipulation of space, light, and acoustics. Cathedral designers learned to create environments that inspire awe and make people feel small in comparison to the divine. Temple builders incorporated mathematical proportions and symbolic elements that reinforced theological concepts through sensory experience. These physical environments became tools for shaping consciousness and reinforcing belief systems. The emergence of religious texts marked another crucial turning point in the evolution of spiritual thinking. Written scriptures didn't just preserve religious teachings, they transformed them into fixed authorities that could be studied, interpreted, and debated across generations. This development made possible much more sophisticated theological systems, and also created new forms of religious scholarship and institutional authority. The interpretation of religious texts became a specialized skill that required years of training and gave interpreters significant social power. This created tensions between literal readings and metaphorical understandings that continue to shape religious communities today. The question of who has the authority to interpret sacred texts and how those interpretations should be applied to contemporary situations remains one of the most contentious issues in religious life. The spread of religious ideas across cultural boundaries represents one of the most remarkable examples of mimetic evolution in human history. Successful religious concepts didn't just survive within the communities that created them. They adapted and spread to entirely different cultural contexts. This process required religious ideas to be flexible enough to address universal human needs while remaining coherent enough to maintain their essential character. The globalization of major religious traditions created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and also new sources of conflict and misunderstanding. When religious systems developed in one cultural context encountered different societies with their own spiritual traditions, the results ranged from peaceful synthesis to violent confrontation. These encounters forced religious communities to define their core beliefs more precisely and to develop new strategies for relating to alternative spiritual frameworks. The relationship between religious authority and political power became one of the defining characteristics of complex human societies. Religious leaders could legitimize political rulers by claiming divine sanction for their authority, while political leaders could use religious institutions to maintain social order and cultural cohesion. This alliance between spiritual and temporal power created some of the most stable and influential institutions in human history. But it also generated conflicts that continue to shape contemporary politics. The tension between religious tradition and social change has been a constant theme throughout human history. Religious institutions often serve as guardians of cultural continuity, preserving values and practices that might otherwise be lost. But this conservative function can also create resistance to necessary adaptations and innovations. The challenge of maintaining spiritual authenticity while responding to changing circumstances remains one of the central dilemmas facing religious communities today. The modern era has brought unprecedented challenges to traditional religious frameworks, but rather than disappearing, gods have simply evolved to address contemporary anxieties. Today's spiritual movements often incorporate elements that speak directly to modern concerns about technology, environmental destruction, and social alienation. Digital age spirituality has created entirely new categories of religious experience, from online religious communities to apps that guide meditation and prayer. This technological integration represents yet another chapter in the ongoing story of how humans continuously reinvent their relationships with the divine. The psychological mechanisms that originally drove our ancestors to create gods remain remarkably consistent across time and culture. Modern neuroscience has revealed that religious experiences activate the same brain regions associated with love, awe, and social bonding. When people report feeling the presence of the divine, their brains show measurable changes in activity patterns that mirror the neurological signatures of profound interpersonal connection. This suggests that the capacity for religious experience isn't just cultural conditioning. It's built into the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. Brain imaging studies have shown that prayer and meditation produce distinct neurological effects that promote feelings of peace, unity, and transcendence. These aren't just subjective experiences, they're measurable changes in brain chemistry that can improve mental health, reduce anxiety, and enhance overall well-being. This neurobiological foundation for religious experience helps explain why spiritual practices remain compelling even in societies with sophisticated scientific understanding of natural phenomena. The placebo effect provides another fascinating window into how belief systems influence physical reality. When people genuinely believe that divine intervention can heal illness or solve problems, their bodies often respond as if that intervention were actually occurring. The power of faith to produce measurable changes in health outcomes demonstrates that the boundary between psychological and physical reality is far more porous than we typically assume. This doesn't prove that gods exist, but it does show that believing in gods can have real, tangible consequences. Religious rituals continue to serve crucial social functions even in secular societies. Wedding ceremonies, funeral rites, and coming-of-age celebrations provide structured ways for communities to mark important transitions and reinforce social bonds. Even people who don't consider themselves religious often participate in these rituals because they fulfill deep psychological needs for meaning, belonging, and continuity. The persistence of these practices suggests that the human need for sacred experiences transcends specific theological beliefs. The rise of conspiracy theories in the digital age reveals how the same psychological mechanisms that create religious beliefs continue to shape human thinking in new contexts. People who see hidden patterns in random events, who attribute intentionality to impersonal forces, and who organize their worldview around unprovable assumptions, are displaying the same cognitive tendencies that led our ancestors to invent gods. The difference is that modern conspiracy theories often replace supernatural agents with secretive human organizations, but the underlying mental processes remain remarkably similar. Social media has created new forms of tribal identity and group loyalty that mirror many aspects of traditional religious communities. Online movements develop their own mythologies, moral codes, and persecution narratives. They create in-group and out-group distinctions that generate the same kind of passionate devotion and defensive hostility that characterizes religious conflicts. The speed and intensity of digital communication has amplified these tendencies, creating ideological echo chambers that can become as insular and self-reinforcing as any traditional religious sect. The environmental crisis has sparked new forms of spiritual thinking that blend scientific understanding with religious sensibilities. Deep ecology movements treat the natural world as sacred and worthy of reverence, independent of human utility. Climate activism often takes on religious characteristics, complete with apocalyptic narratives, moral imperatives, and calls for personal sacrifice in service of a higher purpose. These developments suggest that humans will continue to create godlike concepts whenever they face challenges that exceed their individual capacity to understand or control. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence represents perhaps the most modern expression of humanity's ancient desire to discover that we're not alone in the universe. The psychological appeal of finding other intelligent life forms mirrors many aspects of traditional religious longing. People want to believe that consciousness exists beyond Earth, that intelligence pervades the cosmos, and that contact with alien civilizations might provide answers to fundamental questions about existence and purpose. This secular version of religious hope demonstrates how deeply embedded these psychological needs remain in human nature. The development of artificial intelligence has raised new questions about consciousness, soul, and the nature of intelligence that echo ancient theological debates. As machines become increasingly sophisticated, people are beginning to wonder whether they might develop something analogous to consciousness or spirituality. The possibility that humans might create genuinely intelligent beings forces us to reconsider what makes consciousness special and whether the capacity for religious experience might emerge in any sufficiently complex information processing system. The persistence of near-death experiences across cultures and throughout history provides another example of how consistent features of human neurology generate seemingly supernatural phenomena. People who have been clinically dead and then revived often report remarkably similar experiences involving tunnels of light, encounters with deceased relatives, and feelings of profound peace and love. These experiences feel completely real to those who have them and often produce lasting changes in personality and worldview. While neuroscience can explain these phenomena as products of oxygen-deprived brains, the consistency and transformative power of these experiences continues to fuel beliefs in afterlife consciousness. The globalization of religious ideas in the modern era has created unprecedented opportunities for spiritual synthesis and innovation. People can now easily access teachings from traditions that were previously isolated by geography and culture. This has led to the emergence of hybrid spiritual movements that combine elements from multiple religious traditions, creating new forms of belief that address contemporary needs while drawing on ancient wisdom. These syncretic movements demonstrate the ongoing evolution of religious thinking in response to changing social conditions. The role of religious institutions in providing social services and community support remains crucial even in societies with extensive government welfare systems. Religious organizations often serve as first responders during natural disasters, provide care for vulnerable populations, and create networks of mutual support that extend far beyond their theological missions. This practical dimension of religious life helps explain why faith communities persist even when their supernatural claims become less credible to educated populations. The relationship between religious belief and mental health continues to be one of the most studied aspects of spirituality in the modern era. Research consistently shows that people with strong religious commitments tend to have better outcomes for depression, anxiety, and addiction recovery. The social support, meaning-making frameworks, and behavioral guidelines provided by religious communities offer powerful resources for psychological resilience. This doesn't prove that religious beliefs are true, but it does demonstrate that they serve important functions for human well-being. The emergence of secular alternatives to traditional religion reveals both the enduring human need for transcendent experiences and the possibility of fulfilling those needs without supernatural beliefs. Movements like ethical humanism, scientific pantheism, and philosophical Buddhism attempt to provide the community, meaning, and moral guidance traditionally offered by religion while maintaining intellectual integrity about the natural world. These developments suggest that the psychological functions served by religious belief can be separated from specific theological claims about divine beings. The study of religious evolution in real time provides unprecedented insights into how new spiritual movements emerge and spread. Researchers can now observe the formation of new religious communities, track how their beliefs develop and change, and analyze the social and psychological factors that determine their success or failure. This contemporary evidence supplements archaeological and historical data to create a more complete picture of how religious thinking has shaped human societies throughout our species' history. The impact of scientific education on religious belief has been less straightforward than many predicted. While scientific literacy does tend to reduce acceptance of literal interpretations of ancient religious texts, it hasn't eliminated the psychological needs that drive religious thinking. Instead, many educated people have developed more sophisticated theological frameworks that accommodate scientific understanding while preserving space for spiritual experience and meaning. This adaptation demonstrates the remarkable flexibility of religious thinking in the face of new information about the natural world. The question of whether artificial intelligence might eventually develop something analogous to religious beliefs raises fascinating possibilities about the nature of consciousness and spirituality. If machines become sufficiently complex to experience uncertainty, mortality salience, and the need for meaning, they might independently develop belief systems similar to those created by humans. This possibility forces us to consider whether religious thinking is an inevitable consequence of advanced intelligence or a unique quirk of biological evolution. The ongoing debate between religious and secular worldviews in modern democratic societies reflects deeper questions about how communities should organize themselves and what values should guide collective decision-making. These discussions often reveal that the fundamental psychological and social functions served by religious beliefs remain relevant even when the specific supernatural claims become less credible. The challenge facing contemporary societies is how to preserve the benefits of religious community and meaning-making while maintaining intellectual honesty about the natural world. The invention of gods by our ancient ancestors set in motion a cultural evolution that continues to shape human experience in profound ways. Every generation faces the challenge of inheriting spiritual traditions from the past, while adapting them to address contemporary circumstances. This ongoing process of religious innovation and adaptation ensures that the story of how humans create and recreate their relationships with the divine will continue for as long as our species exists. The gods we invent tomorrow will undoubtedly be different from those our ancestors created around Paleolithic campfires, but they will serve the same fundamental human needs for meaning, community, and hope in the face of an uncertain universe. The transformation of human consciousness through religious belief created ripple effects that extended far beyond spiritual practices into every aspect of how our species organizes itself. When early humans began attributing agency and intention to natural forces, they unknowingly triggered a cascade of cognitive changes that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. This wasn't just about creating comfort stories or explaining mysterious phenomena. It was about rewiring the basic operating system of human cognition in ways that made unprecedented forms of cooperation and social organization possible. Consider what happened when scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers first began to share beliefs about invisible agents who could observe and judge their behavior. Suddenly, moral conduct became a matter of cosmic significance, rather than just practical social dynamics. A person alone in the wilderness wasn't really alone anymore. They were being watched by entities whose approval or disapproval could have eternal consequences. This invisible surveillance system created the psychological foundation for large-scale societies where strangers could trust each other to follow shared moral codes even when no human authority was present to enforce them. The development of standardized religious festivals and rituals created the first truly universal human experiences that could unite people across tribal boundaries. When different communities discovered they shared similar spiritual practices and beliefs, it became possible for them to see each other as part of a larger cosmic family, rather than simply competitors for resources. This recognition of shared spiritual identity laid the groundwork for the formation of chiefdoms, kingdoms, and eventually nation-states that could encompass millions of people who would never meet each other personally. Religious thinking also revolutionized human relationships with time and causality in ways that made long-term planning and delayed gratification psychologically feasible. Before spiritual frameworks emerged, human behavior was largely driven by immediate needs and short-term consequences. But once people began believing in divine judgment, karma, or other systems of cosmic justice that operated over extended time periods, they could motivate themselves to endure present hardships for the sake of future rewards that might not materialize for years, decades, or even lifetimes. This temporal extension of cause and effect thinking enabled the development of complex agricultural systems that required years of labor before producing returns. It made possible the construction of monumental architecture projects that might take generations to complete. Most importantly, it allowed human communities to accumulate knowledge and resources across multiple generations in pursuit of goals that no individual could achieve within a single lifetime. The great libraries, universities, and scientific institutions that preserve and expand human knowledge all depend on this religiously inspired capacity to think beyond immediate personal interests. The psychological mechanisms that drive religious belief also created the cognitive foundation for abstract mathematics, philosophical reasoning, and scientific thinking. The same mental processes that allow people to believe in invisible spiritual agents also enable them to work with abstract concepts like numbers, logical principles, and theoretical models. The capacity to manipulate purely conceptual entities in systematic ways represents one of the most distinctive features of human intelligence, and it emerged directly from the cognitive abilities that made religious thinking possible. This connection between spiritual and rational thinking helps explain why some of the most important advances in mathematics, science, and philosophy have historically emerged from religious contexts. Ancient priests were often the most educated members of their societies, responsible not just for spiritual guidance, but also for astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and record-keeping. The disciplined mental training required for theological study developed intellectual skills that proved valuable for understanding natural phenomena and solving practical problems. The institutionalization of religious authority created some of the first formal educational systems in human history. Religious schools and monasteries preserved literacy during periods when secular institutions collapsed. They maintained libraries, copied manuscripts, and transmitted knowledge across generations when no other social institutions had the resources or motivation to do so. The modern university system evolved directly from medieval religious institutions that combined spiritual training with secular learning in ways that established the basic template for higher education. Religious communities also pioneered many of the organizational structures that would later be adopted by secular institutions. Hierarchical command structures, standardized procedures, financial management systems, and conflict resolution mechanisms were all developed first in religious contexts before being adapted for military, governmental, and commercial use. The Catholic Church, for example, created one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in human history, managing resources and coordinating activities across multiple continents for over 1,000 years. The global spread of religious ideas created the first truly international networks of communication and cultural exchange. Pilgrimage routes, missionary activities, and religious trade connections linked distant regions in ways that facilitated the exchange of not just spiritual ideas, but also technological innovations, artistic techniques, and scientific knowledge. These religious networks often served as the foundation for later commercial and diplomatic relationships that shaped the development of global civilization. The emphasis on written scriptures and textual interpretation in many religious traditions drove innovations in literacy, printing technology, and mass communication that had far-reaching secular applications. The desire to make religious texts widely available motivated the development of more efficient writing systems, cheaper paper production methods, and faster printing techniques. These technological advances then enabled the spread of secular literature, scientific publications, and popular media that transformed how information flows through human societies. Religious concepts of universal moral law provided the intellectual foundation for the development of human rights, international law, and democratic governance systems. The idea that all people possess inherent dignity and moral worth, regardless of their social status or tribal affiliation, emerged from religious teachings about the equal spiritual value of all souls. This spiritual egalitarianism created the conceptual framework that later secular philosophers would use to justify political equality and individual rights. The religious emphasis on personal conscience and individual moral responsibility also contributed to the development of concepts of personal freedom and autonomy that became central to modern democratic thinking. The idea that each person must answer to divine authority for their actions implied a level of individual moral agency that was incompatible with purely authoritarian social systems. Religious traditions that emphasized personal spiritual development and direct relationship with the divine inadvertently created psychological conditions that supported demands for political and intellectual freedom. The competitive dynamics between different religious traditions drove innovations in persuasion, argumentation, and intellectual sophistication that advanced human reasoning capabilities. When religious communities had to defend their beliefs against rival systems, they were forced to develop more rigorous logical arguments, more compelling emotional appeals, and more sophisticated theological frameworks. This intellectual competition created selection pressures that favored religious traditions with greater explanatory power and psychological appeal, leading to increasingly refined spiritual systems. The mystical traditions within major religions pioneered techniques for altering consciousness and exploring the subjective dimensions of human experience that would later influence psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science. Meditation practices, contemplative disciplines, and other spiritual technologies for investigating the nature of mind provided some of the earliest systematic approaches to understanding consciousness from a first-person perspective. These introspective methods generated insights about attention, awareness, and mental training that complement and extend scientific approaches to studying the brain. Religious art and architecture pushed the boundaries of human creative expression in ways that advanced aesthetic understanding and technical capabilities across multiple domains. The desire to create worthy expressions of spiritual devotion motivated innovations in painting, sculpture, music, and building design that established artistic standards and techniques that continue to influence creative work today. Sacred art served as a laboratory for experimenting with new forms of beauty and meaning that expanded human aesthetic possibilities. The religious emphasis on compassion, charity, and social service created some of the first systematic approaches to addressing poverty, disease, and social inequality. Religious institutions developed hospitals, schools, and social service organizations that provided models for later secular welfare systems. The moral imperative to care for the vulnerable and marginalized that characterizes most religious traditions helped establish social norms around mutual aid and collective responsibility that remain crucial for maintaining stable societies. Religious festivals and communal celebrations created templates for organizing large-scale social events that bring people together for shared experiences of joy, meaning, and connection. These gatherings served important psychological functions by providing regular opportunities for community bonding, cultural transmission, and collective emotional release. The techniques developed for coordinating religious ceremonies and managing crowd dynamics provided organizational knowledge that was later applied to secular events, political rallies, and entertainment productions. The apocalyptic and eschatological elements present in many religious traditions created frameworks for thinking about long-term threats and collective survival that influenced how human societies prepare for and respond to existential challenges. Religious narratives about end times, judgment, and renewal provided conceptual tools for imagining catastrophic scenarios and planning responses to threats that might not materialize for generations. These future-oriented thinking patterns help develop the psychological capacity for addressing long-term challenges like environmental degradation, resource depletion, and technological risks. Religious dietary laws, purity codes, and behavioral restrictions served as early experiments in social engineering that tested how shared behavioral norms could be used to maintain group identity and promote collective welfare. These rule systems provided practical experience with the challenges of creating and enforcing community standards that would later inform the development of secular legal systems and public policy approaches. The religious emphasis on confession, forgiveness, and redemption created early models for restorative justice and conflict resolution that offered alternatives to purely punitive approaches to wrongdoing. Religious traditions developed sophisticated understanding of how guilt, shame, and social reconciliation function psychologically, generating insights that would later influence therapeutic practices and criminal justice reform efforts. The missionary activities of expanding religious traditions created some of the first systematic approaches to cross-cultural communication and adaptation. Religious communities learned how to translate complex ideas across linguistic and cultural boundaries, how to identify universal human needs and concerns, and how to adapt their message to different social contexts while maintaining core principles. These skills proved valuable for later diplomatic, commercial, and educational activities that required effective intercultural engagement. The monastic traditions within various religions conducted some of the earliest controlled experiments in alternative social organization, testing how communities could function with different economic systems, governance structures, and lifestyle practices. Monasteries and religious communes served as living laboratories for exploring questions about property ownership, leadership authority, gender roles, and work organization that provided valuable data about human social possibilities. So here we are, 30,000 years after that first human heard something rustling in the darkness and dared to imagine what it might be. That moment of creative speculation around a Paleolithic campfire has cascaded through millennia to shape virtually every aspect of how we live, think, and organize ourselves today. The gods we invented didn't just comfort our fears or explain the unexplainable. They fundamentally rewired human consciousness and made possible the emergence of civilization itself. Understanding this process isn't just about satisfying intellectual curiosity about our past. It's about recognizing the extraordinary creative power of human belief and imagination to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of our species. Whether the gods our descendants create will help us navigate the challenges ahead or become obstacles to our continued evolution depends on how well we understand the psychological and social forces that drive their invention. The story of why humans invented gods is really the story of why we became human in the first place.